On November 14th, 1938, in a room at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, William Lygon, 7th Earl Beauchamp, lay dying of cancer. He was 66 years old. Outside, Manhattan was loud with traffic and light. Inside, there was none of the life that had once defined him. No moat, no chapel, no library at Madresfield where his daughters had lain at his feet while he read aloud. Only hotel furniture, traveling cases, the stillness of a room hired by the night, and a man who had once been a cabinet minister, Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, and father of 7 children, now more than 3,000 miles from the house his family had held for centuries. 7 years earlier, political enemies had forced him out of England after threatening to expose his homosexuality. He had come back once briefly, then he had gone again. And on that November day, the exile ended only because his life did. To the public, the Beauchamp had looked like one of those English families built to last. Title, office, money, children, a great house behind its moat. But the private reality was different, and by the time Beauchamp died in New York, the family at the center of that image had already been shattered from within. This is the story of what shattered it: a brother-in-law's campaign, a wife who chose her birth family over her husband, 7 children ordered to testify against their father and refusing, one son dead in Bavaria before he was 32, and a house that survived everything the people inside it could not. It is the story of how the Lygons kept the name, kept Madresfield, and lost almost everything else. But to understand how a family that powerful, that visible, that deeply woven into the fabric of British public life came apart so completely, not across generations, not through the slow erosion of death duties and changing times, but in a matter of weeks, you have to go back. Not just to the marriage or the title. You have to go back to the house, to the land, to the particular kind of dynasty that the Lygons built across 5 centuries in Worcestershire, and to the code of continuity, silence, and display that made the name what it was long before the 7th Earl inherited it, and long before the woman he married helped destroy it. This is the story of a family that spent half a millennium turning a manor house into a symbol of English permanence, and then watched it survive a catastrophe that scattered nearly every person who lived inside it. It is the story of 7 children, 2 parents, a title, a house, a secret, and a betrayal that rewrote the private history of one of England's most outwardly magnificent households. The Lygon name would endure. Madresfield Court would stand. The earldom of Beauchamp would carry on for another half-century. But the family that gave those things their meaning, that particular gathering of people, in that particular house, at that particular moment in English life, would not survive what happened in the summer of 1931. One son would drink himself to death in a Bavarian town before the age of 32. One daughter would lose a royal future she had done nothing to forfeit. The mother would die, estranged from nearly all of her children. The father would die in exile in a hotel in New York, thousands of miles from the moat and the library and the chapel where his wife had once built something beautiful for the both of them. And the earldom itself, that title earned across a century of service, would end in 1979 when the eldest son died without an heir, and the name passed into history. To understand the scale of what was lost, you have to understand what had been built. The Lygons came to Madresfield in the early 15th century. The manor, tucked between the Malvern Hills and the River Severn in Worcestershire, entered the family's orbit through the marriage of Joan Bracy to Thomas Lygon. One of those quiet alliances of land and name that in medieval England functioned as the machinery of dynasty making long before anyone thought to call it that. What mattered was this: the house stayed, the family stayed. Across the Wars of the Roses, across the Tudor upheavals, across the Civil War and the Restoration, and the long, stable centuries of Hanoverian rule, Madresfield remained a Lygon seat. That kind of continuity is rare in English country house history. Most great houses changed hands. Souls seized, inherited sideways through daughters and nephews and distant cousins. Madresfield did not. The line held, and with it the understanding that the house was not merely a property. It was a statement. The Lygons did not move. The Lygons endured. By the 19th century, the family had risen from the ranks of the landed gentry into the titled aristocracy. William Lygon was created Baron Beauchamp in 1806 and Earl Beauchamp in 1815. a peerage that reflected not just wealth, but political service, public visibility, and the kind of steady, respectable influence that the early 19th century establishment rewarded with coronets. The earldom gave the family a seat in the House of Lords, a place in the court circular, and the expectation that came with both that every subsequent generation would carry the title with the same combination of landed stewardship, political engagement, and social propriety that had earned it. That expectation was not decorative, it was structural. To be Earl Beauchamp was to be watched, to be judged against a standard that the family had set for itself across 400 years of holding the same ground. The ground itself was considerable. By the time the seventh Earl inherited, the Madresfield estate comprised roughly 5,000 acres of Worcestershire farmland, a serious agricultural holding that placed the family firmly in the upper ranks of the county gentry even before the title elevated them further. 5,000 acres of English land in that era was not simply wealth. It was a network of tenancies, rents, obligations, laborers' cottages, farm buildings, and the particular kind of social authority that came from being the largest employer and the largest landowner within the radius of a market town. It meant the Beauchamps were not just a family, they were an institution. The village depended on them. The church depended on them. The local economy moved in ways both visible and invisible, according to decisions made inside the house. And the house sat at the center of it all, a medieval core rebuilt and extended in the Victorian period into a romantic fantasy of gables, bays, and half timbering, surrounded by a moat that had been there since the Middle Ages. The moat is worth pausing on. In most English country houses, a moat is a curiosity, a remnant of military architecture repurposed as ornament, something visitors photograph from the drive. At Madresfield, it was something more. It was a boundary. The house stood inside its own water, separated from the surrounding parkland, by a physical line that said quietly but unmistakably that what happened within belonged to the family and no one else. In the years to come, that boundary would take on a meaning that nobody intended. It would become the line between the public world that judged and the private world that endured. Inside that boundary, the seventh Earl would transform the house into something extraordinary. A vast staircase hall, designed in the arts and crafts style, rose through the center of the building, a space of carved wood, stained glass, an heraldic display that turned the simple act of climbing stairs into a procession through the family's own history. Every panel, every carved figure, every pane of colored glass was a declaration. We were here before you, and we will be here after. The chapel, commissioned by his wife as a wedding present, became one of the finest private ecclesiastical interiors in England, painted, gilded, devoted to a faith that both husband and wife professed with genuine intensity. It was a gesture of devotion, taste, and conjugal ambition that would later acquire a bitter irony, given what the marriage became. The library accumulated across generations. The gardens were laid out with formal precision. The park and grounds, later registered as Grade Sturdu by Historic England, carried the weight of centuries of careful stewardship. The whole estate was a theater of belonging, a physical argument for the idea that the Lygons belonged exactly where they were and always had. But a house is not a family, and the code that Madresfield embodied, continuity, display, public duty, and above all silence about anything that might disturb the picture, was not merely a set of aesthetic preferences. It was a set of rules, rules about what could be said and what could not, rules about what the world was permitted to see and what must remain behind the moat. The Lygons were visible, the Lygons were watched, the Lygons maintained appearances, and the cost of that maintenance as the 20th century turned, and the seventh Earl began the public career that would take him to the very center of British power, was that the private truth had to stay invisible. For a while, it did. That stability would last nearly 30 years, and then it shattered. William Lygon, 7th Earl Beauchamp, was born on the 14th of February, 1872, and from the beginning his life followed the trajectory that his name demanded. Eton, then Christ Church, Oxford, the standard route for a young man of his rank, the institutional pipeline that produced bishops, cabinet ministers, colonial governors, and the kind of confident public figure that the late Victorian establishment required. What it also produced, though the world preferred not to say so, was a particular kind of double life. A world in which a man could be devout, ambitious, publicly virtuous, and privately drawn to desires that his class tolerated only so long as they remained invisible. William was all of those things. He was handsome, tall, high church in his faith, progressive in his politics, and gifted with the kind of charm that made people feel they were being taken into his confidence, even when he was telling them nothing at all. He believed in tolerance. He would teach the word to his daughters years later, lying on the floor of the Madresfield library while they curled at his feet and listened to him read. It was the word he wanted them to carry into the world. It was also the word that the world would refuse to extend to him. His public rise was swift and genuine. He was elected mayor of Worcester at the extraordinary age of 23, not as a ceremonial gesture, but as a marker of the civic engagement that would define his career. He entered the House of Lords, served as a liberal whip, and by the first decade of the new century had become a figure of real political weight. Between 1899 and 1901, he served as governor of New South Wales, a posting that took him to the other side of the world and planted the family's name in Australian public life. He returned to England and rose further. A cabinet minister under Asquith, Lord President of the Council, leader of the Liberal Party in the Lords, and ultimately Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, one of the great ceremonial offices of the English state. The wardenship came with Walmer Castle in Kent, a Tudor fortress on the coast, smaller and more intimate than Madresfield, and infinitely more private. Walmer gave the Earl a second household, a life at the coast, a place to entertain company that he chose rather than inherited. Photographs from those years show the family at Walmer in sunlight and ease, children on lawns, the sea beyond, a handsome father presiding. The images tell the truth. They simply do not tell all of it. What the public saw in the years before 1931 was a man who appeared to have everything that the British establishment valued: title, land, office, faith, family, a great house, a famous name, and the quiet, authoritative bearing that made him seem, to those who did not know the private truth, like the very model of an Edwardian aristocrat doing exactly what his class was built to do. No, what the public did not see, or chose not to see, was that the seventh Earl was also a man whose deepest desires placed him in criminal jeopardy under the laws of his own country. Homosexuality was not merely stigmatized in interwar Britain. It was a criminal offense, prosecutable under the same statutes that had destroyed Oscar Wilde a generation earlier. Beauchamp's private life was tolerated by those who knew of it, tolerated in the particular English way, which meant that people looked away, murmured to each other in clubs and drawing rooms, and expected that discretion would hold. It held for decades, until it did not. His wife, Lady Lettice Grosvenor, was born in 1876 into the very center of the English aristocratic world. She was a daughter of the first Duke of Westminster, one of the wealthiest men in England, whose family controlled vast swathes of Mayfair and Belgravia, and whose name carried a weight in British society that few hereditary titles could rival. The Grosvenors were not merely rich. They were embedded. Their influence reached from the great London squares to the palace, from the hunting field to the House of Lords, and to marry a Grosvenor daughter was to bind your family to one of the most powerful social networks in the country. Lettice brought that network into the Beauchamp household. She brought money, she brought connections, and she brought the particular kind of social confidence that came from growing up inside a family that believed itself to be, in some fundamental sense, at the center of things. She was beautiful, well-connected, and bred to the expectations of her world. She understood instinctively what was required of a woman in her position: the management of a great house, the bearing of heirs, the performance of public duty, the commissioning of tasteful art and architecture, and the maintenance of the appearance that all of these things were effortless. She was not a passive figure. The chapel at Madresfield was her creation, her wedding present to the household, and the ambition of it, the scale, the expense, the theological seriousness, tells you something about who she was. She intended to shape this family, not merely inhabit it. And for years, she did. What she may not have understood when she married in 1902, or may have understood and chosen to look away from, as so many women in her position did, was that the man she had married was already, by the standards of the law and the church, living a life that could destroy them both. Whether she knew before the wedding or discovered it afterwards is not something the public record resolves. What is clear is that the marriage produced 7 children, lasted nearly 3 decades, and ended in a catastrophe that left Lettuce estranged from almost every one of them. But the catastrophe had an engine beyond the Earl's own secrets, and that engine was Lettuce's brother. Hugh Richard Arthur Grosvenor, 2nd Duke of Westminster, was born in 1879, and he was by almost every surviving account one of the most formidable and vindictive men in interwar British society. He was fabulously, almost absurdly wealthy. The Grosvenor fortune, built on London real estate that appreciated with every passing decade, dwarfed most aristocratic holdings in England. He was politically conservative, where his brother-in-law was liberal. He was socially ruthless in a way that went beyond the ordinary cruelties of the aristocratic world, and he carried grudges with a tenacity that contemporaries found alarming. He hunted, he raced, he entertained on a scale that was less generosity than performance. And he was also, by a coincidence that matters enormously, a man whose own personal life was chaotic. His first marriage ended in divorce. His second would end the same way. His relationships with women were public, numerous, and conducted with the kind of carelessness that only extreme wealth can sustain without consequence. His moral authority, by any honest assessment, was non-existent. He was not a man who lived by the code he would later use as a weapon. But in a world governed by appearances rather than truth, moral consistency was not required. Power was, and Westminster had it in abundance. He also had something else, a particular kind of resentment toward the brother-in-law who appeared to have assembled, without the Grosvenor millions, exactly the kind of ordered, admired, publicly virtuous family life that Westminster himself could never quite manage. That resentment would curdle, in time, into something far more dangerous than jealousy. It would become a campaign. There is something about the dynamic between these two men, the Earl and the Duke, the brother-in-law and the brother-in-law, that must be understood before the story can continue. They were connected by marriage, separated by politics, and divided by temperament in ways that turned family proximity into a kind of slow-burning danger. Beauchamp was subtle, aesthetic, and private. Westminster was blunt, acquisitive, and public. One operated through charm, faith, and the careful management of perception. The other operated through money, influence, and the willingness to use information as a weapon. The collision between them was not inevitable. Plenty of aristocratic families tolerated far worse secrets than the 7th Earls, without exposure. But once Westminster decided to act, there was no institutional break strong enough to stop him. He was not a man who could be reasoned with, he was a man who could be feared. The 7 children were born across 13 years, from 1903 to 1916, and each of them entered a household that appeared from the outside to offer everything a child could want. What it actually offered was more complicated. William, Viscount Elmley, the eldest, born in 1903, was the heir, the one on whom the dynasty's continuation rested. He carried that weight with a quiet, dutiful reserve that distinguished him from his more vivid siblings. Eton, then Oxford, where his social circle overlapped with some of the most brilliant and reckless young men of his generation. But Elmley was not reckless. He was steady, loyal, and burdened by the particular kind of responsibility that comes from knowing, since childhood, that you will one day inherit something you did not build and cannot quite control. Where his younger brothers sparkled, Elmley observed. Where others threw themselves into the pleasures of their class with abandon, he measured. He was not cold. The family's later loyalty to one another suggests a warmth that ran deep. But he was careful, in the way that eldest sons of fragile dynasties learn to be careful. The title would come to him. The house would come to him. And in 1938, what actually came to him was not a dynasty in its prime, but the hollow shell of one. A great name with the family behind it scattered across Europe, dead, drinking, or estranged. Hugh Patrick Lygon, the second son, born in 1904, was everything his brother was not. He was charming, emotionally open, physically beautiful in the careless way that draws people in before they understand the cost. At Oxford, he became part of the circle that included Evelyn Waugh, and the friendship between them would later become one of the most written about relationships in English literary history. Waugh saw in Hugh something he would spend years trying to capture on the page: the doomed, self-destructive, intensely lovable aristocrat whose charm conceals a wound that nothing can heal. Hugh drank. He drank with the generosity and the helplessness that marks the difference between someone who enjoys wine and someone who needs it. He was his father's emotional mirror, warm, vulnerable, incapable of the protective coldness that might have saved him. And he was the son who, in the first terrible days of exile, when the seventh Earl fled England and contemplated ending his own life, talked his father back from the edge. He was 27 years old. That detail tells you who he was and what the family asked of its children. It also tells you, if you know how the story ends, what the cost would be. Lady Lettice, the eldest daughter, born in 1906, entered the adult world just as the family's surface glamour was at its most seductive. She was named for her mother, a detail that carries its own weight, given how completely she would later reject the woman whose name she bore. She married in 1930, 1 year before the catastrophe, and her early life represents the last unbroken window through which the Beauchamp could be seen as what they appeared: golden, enviable, untouched. Lady Sibel, born in 1907, was the observer. Quieter than her older sister, more watchful, she absorbed the texture of the household in a way that the others, caught up in their own dramas, did not. She noticed things, she remembered things, and in later life, her recollections would preserve the small, devastating details that no historian could have reconstructed from official records alone. The afternoon ritual in the library, the father reading aloud, the particular quality of attention he gave his daughters, and the word tolerance offered like a gift from a man who needed it more than anyone in the room. Sibel would live to be 97 years old. She would become one of the last people alive who remembered what the family was before the fall, and one of the few who could speak with authority about what the fall destroyed. Lady Mary, Mamie, born in 1910, was the daughter whose arc most clearly charts the cost of the scandal on a life that did nothing to earn it. Before 1931, she was courted by Prince George, the king's youngest surviving son. The courtship was real. The prospect of a royal marriage was serious. And when the scandal broke, that future vanished, not because of anything Mary had done, but because a family carrying criminal allegations against the father could not be permitted to marry into the House of Windsor. One conversation, one revelation, one exposure, and a young woman's entire trajectory was rewritten. She would marry later, unhappily, to Prince Vsevolod of Russia, and the marriage would decay into drink, money trouble, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from knowing you once stood at the threshold of a different life and watched it close. Lady Dorothy, known within the family as Coote, was the youngest daughter, born in 1912, still a teenager when everything broke. Her later recollections are among the most valuable sources for understanding what happened inside Madresfield after both parents effectively vanished. She would go on to live one of those long, eccentric, quietly remarkable English lives: war service, embassy work in Addis Ababa, archival dedication, a late marriage to a man 24 years her senior. And in her obituary, the outline of the emptied house is preserved. The father exiled, the mother departed with one son, and the remaining children holding the great house together as though nothing had happened. Everything had happened. Richard Dickey, the youngest, born in 1916, was 15 when the exile began. He's the exception in the family's emotional geography. The only child who, by surviving accounts, maintained some relationship with his mother after the break. He matters also for a different reason. His descendants, not Elmleys, not Hughes, would eventually inherit Madresfield itself. The line that now occupies the house runs through the youngest son. That is not how dynasties are supposed to work. It is how this one, after everything that happened, did. The marriage of William and Lettice, on the 26th of July, 1902, was the joining of two great families and the beginning of a household that for nearly 3 decades presented to the outside world one of the most compelling images of aristocratic stability in Edwardian and interwar England. The chapel that Lettice commissioned, that extraordinary private church, painted and gilded, devoted to a shared faith, was not merely an act of piety. It was an act of possession and of hope. She was marking the house as hers. She was building beauty into a dynasty she intended to shape. And for years, it worked. The children came, one after another, across 13 years. William in 1903, Hugh in 1904, Lettuce in 1906, Sibel in 1907, Mary in 1910, Dorothy in 1912, and Richard in 1916. 7 children in a moated house in Worcestershire, attended by nursemaids and governesses and the whole apparatus of Edwardian upper-class childhood. The nursery on the upper floor, the schoolroom with its structured hours, the seasonal migrations between Madresfield and Walmer in London, the fabric of routine that made a large aristocratic household feel, to the children inside it, like the natural order of the world. The house filled with noise and routine and the particular kind of ordered chaos that 7 children and a large staff and a 5,000-acre estate produce. The library grew. The afternoon reading became ritual. The father on the floor, the daughters at his feet, the word tolerance repeated until it became part of the family's private language. What the children absorbed, alongside the beauty and the books and the rituals of their class, was something harder to name. They absorbed the knowledge that their parents' marriage was a performance as much as a partnership. They absorbed the understanding, articulated or not, and that their father's warmth and their mother's ambition did not quite meet in the middle. The household functioned. It functioned beautifully. But a functioning household is not the same thing as a happy marriage. And by the 1920s, the gap between the Earl's public devotion to his family and the private life he was conducting at Walmer and elsewhere had become something that the older children at least could sense, even if they could not yet name it. There was love in the house. There was also silence, and the silence had a particular texture, the texture of things that everyone could feel and nobody was permitted to discuss. The Beauchamp household, in its best years, operated on 2 parallel tracks. There was the public track, the Earl's offices, the Countess's social engagements, the children's education and presentation, the maintenance of the estate, the country house weekends, the church attendance, the photographs in which everyone smiled and the gardens looked immaculate. And there was the private track, the father's absences, the particular company he kept, the whispers that circulated in London clubs and drawing rooms, and the slow accumulation of knowledge. Among servants, among society acquaintances, among political enemies, that the 7th Earl Beauchamp was not quite the man the public image suggested. Lettuce's position in this arrangement was complex, and the outline of it matters for everything that followed. She was a woman who had invested herself fully in the creation of a household, the chapel, the children, the social machinery, and who was now, by degrees, discovering that the household rested on a foundation she could not control. Whether she confronted her husband directly or maintained the silence that her class demanded is not recorded. What is recorded is that the marriage continued, the children continued to arrive, and the public face of the family remained intact. The Grosvenor network held her in place. The title held her in place. The children held her in place, and the code of her world, the code that said one simply did not speak of such things. One carried on, one maintained appearances at whatever personal cost, held her most firmly of all. The gardens were tended with the care that comes from believing that what you are maintaining will outlast you. The photographs were taken, 7 children, 2 parents, a moated manor in the Worcestershire countryside. A life that looked from every published angle like the fulfillment of everything the English ruling class believed about itself. But the photographs showed only what the camera was pointed at. They did not show what the 7th Earl did at Walmer, or who he kept company with on those long weekends at the coast, or the social whispers that had begun to circulate in the 1920s among people who paid attention to such things. The aristocracy of interwar Britain was not naive. It understood that men of Beauchamp's temperament existed within its ranks. It looked away. It relied on discretion, on the unspoken agreement that private lives would remain private so long as the surface held. And the surface at Madresfield was magnificent. The children were growing, the offices were accumulating, the family was shining. And nobody, not the children in the library, not the wife in the chapel, not the Earl himself, reading aloud about tolerance in the long afternoon light, it understood that the code of silence they all depended on had already begun to crack. For years, the world had looked at Madresfield and seen security. In 1930, men in London and Sydney began collecting the facts that would make that security impossible. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. But before the evidence, before the detectives and the lawyers and the king, there were the years when it worked. And those years matter, not as a preamble to disaster, but as the thing that was destroyed. If the audience does not feel what the Beauchamp family had, the loss of it cannot land. So it is worth staying inside the beauty for a while, because the people who lived it stayed inside it for decades, and the children who lost it spent the rest of their lives measuring everything else against it. The household at Madresfield, in the years between the end of the Great War and the catastrophe of 1931, operated with the rhythms and rituals of a world that still believed itself to be permanent. The estate ran on a cycle that had not fundamentally changed in a century. Tenants, rents, harvest, the management of woodland and pasture, the maintenance of cottages and farm buildings, the seasonal calendar of a 5,000-acre agricultural operation that employed dozens of people and shaped the life of the surrounding parish. The house itself required a staff of considerable size: housemaids, footmen, a cook, a butler, gardeners, grooms, a chauffeur, and the choreography of running it, the precise and largely invisible labor that kept the silver polished and the fires lit and the meals served on time, was Lettice's domain. She managed it with the competence of a woman who had grown up watching the Grosvenor machine operate at a far grander scale. And whatever was breaking between her and her husband in private, the household itself functioned with an outward smoothness that visitors found impressive. The children moved through this world as though it had been made for them, which in a sense it had. The older boys went to Eton, that inevitable first step in the formation of a ruling class Englishman, and then to Oxford, where the social world that would define the interwar generation was already assembling itself in colleges and clubs, and the particular kind of beautiful, destructive friendships that young men of privilege formed with each other between tutorials. Emily went up to Magdalen. Hugh followed. And it was at Oxford in the early 1920s that the Lygon world began to intersect with the world that Evelyn Waugh was observing, absorbing, and would one day reimagine as fiction. The Lygon brothers were not obscure undergraduates. They were the sons of an earl, the inheritors of a famous house, and they carried with them the glamour of Madresfield, the moat, the library, the staircase hall, the sense of a family that had been somewhere for a very long time. Waugh noticed. He noticed everything. And when he was eventually invited to Madresfield itself, what he found there was not merely a grand house, but a household that combined grandeur with a warmth and an eccentricity that the more rigid aristocratic families could not match. The Earl read to his daughters on the library floor. The children teased each other with affection. The house was full of beautiful objects and easy laughter and the kind of intellectual seriousness that came from a father who believed in books and tolerance and the duty of privilege to be more than decorative. It was, in Waugh's later reckoning, something close to a paradise. It was also, though he could not have known it yet, already marked for destruction. The family's social world extended well beyond Worcestershire. There was London, where the Beauchamps maintained the connections that the Earl's political career required and the Countess's Grosvenor background demanded. Dinners, receptions, the theater, the machinery of influence that operated through drawing rooms and dining tables, and the careful choreography of being seen with the right people at the right events. There was Walmer, the coastal castle that provided a second stage for family life, the children photographed against the sea, the picnics on the Broad Walk, the long summer days that carry in retrospect the particular ache of happiness that people did not know was temporary. The family photographs from Walmer are striking even now. The children arranged in sunlight, the father handsome and assured, the setting combining the grandeur of a Tudor fortress with the intimacy of a seaside holiday. They look like what they were. They also look like something that cannot last. And there were the institutional rituals of the class, Ascot and Henley and the country house weekends that moved the same circle of families through the same drawing rooms across the same summer months. The pattern of social life that gave the English aristocracy its sense of itself as a continuous, self-renewing community. The Beauchamps belonged to this world completely. They were not aspirants or outsiders. They were fixtures, recognized, respected, and, in the Earl's case, admired for the combination of political seriousness and aesthetic refinement that distinguished him from the bluffer, more sporting type of aristocrat that the interwar establishment also produced. The daughters, as they grew, moved into this world with the ease that comes from having been raised to expect nothing less. Lady Lettice, the eldest, was presented at court, made the round of dances and dinners and house parties that constituted the marriage market of her class, and in 1930 married Sir Richard Cotterell, a match that was, by the standards of their world, entirely satisfactory. Sybil followed her sister into the social round, though with a temperament more inclined to observation than performance. Mary, the most vivacious of the sisters, drew attention wherever she went. She was beautiful, she was lively, and she carried the Beauchamp name with a confidence that reflected both her father's charm and her mother's social training. Prince George noticed her. The courtship began, and with it came the possibility, tantalizing, almost unimaginable, that a daughter of Madresfield might marry into the royal family itself. That possibility, real and documented, is one of the measures of how high the Beauchamp family stood in the years before the fall. They were not merely among the aristocracy, they were within reach of the crown. The Earl's career, by the mid-1920s, had reached a level of public eminence that few men of his generation could match. He had served in the cabinet, he led the Liberal peers in the House of Lords, he held the wardenship of the Cinque Ports, that ancient office that placed him, ceremonially at least, in the lineage of the Duke of Wellington and William Pitt. He was a Knight of the Garter, one of the highest orders of chivalry and the gift of the crown. He was invited to state occasions. He sat near the top table. He was in every visible measure a man who had fulfilled the promise of his name and his house. And the family that surrounded him, the beautiful wife, the 7 children, the 2 great houses, the libraries and gardens and chapels, formed an image so complete, so apparently harmonious, that it became difficult for anyone who saw it to imagine that it could be anything other than what it appeared. That was the danger. The image was so good that it became its own kind of trap. The better the family looked from the outside, the more catastrophic any exposure of the private truth would be. And the private truth, by the late 1920s, was becoming harder to contain. At Walmer, away from Lettice and the children's routines and the watchful eyes of the Worcestershire parish, the Earl lived a second life. It was not a secret life, exactly, that implies a level of concealment that the evidence does not fully support. It was more a parallel life, one that existed in the spaces between his public duties and his family obligations. The guest lists for weekends at the coastal castle included young men whose relationship to the Earl was not adequately explained by any professional or social connection that the outside world could identify. There were valets and secretaries and traveling companions who stayed longer than their roles required, and whose intimacy with the Earl was visible to anyone who chose to look. Some of the household staff knew. Some of the visiting friends knew, and gradually, through the inevitable leakage that occurs when a prominent man's private behavior contradicts his public persona, the knowledge spread beyond Walmer's walls and into the networks of gossip that connected London's clubs and country houses. The whispers had been circulating in certain circles for years, not loudly, not publicly, but with the steady, corrosive persistence that gossip acquires in a world where everyone knows everyone and privacy is a negotiated fiction. At White's, at Brooks's, in the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the corridors of the House of Lords, men who understood such things exchanged glances and half-sentences about the 7th Earl. Beauchamp's homosexuality was not in the strict sense a secret. It was an open secret, which is to say, it was known to enough people to be dangerous, but not yet known to the one person who had both the motive and the power to weaponize it. That person was the Duke of Westminster, and his motive, when it crystallized, was not purely moral. It was personal, political, and vindictive in roughly equal measure. He resented his brother-in-law's success. He resented the liberal politics that Beauchamp represented. Westminster was not merely conservative, but actively hostile to the progressive causes that the Earl championed. He resented with the particular bitterness of a man whose own domestic life had twice ended in the wreckage of divorce, the spectacle of Beauchamp's apparently stable household. And he had, by the late 1920s, begun to hear the same whispers that everyone else had been choosing to ignore. The difference was that Westminster did not intend to ignore them. He intended to use them. He began to collect. He hired investigators. He made inquiries. He waited for the moment when the evidence would be strong enough to act upon and the political conditions right enough to guarantee that his intervention would succeed. The first crack appeared not at Madresfield or Walmer, but on the other side of the world. In 1930, the Earl embarked on a round-the-world tour, the kind of extended journey that men of his class undertook for pleasure, for health, and sometimes for the opportunity to live at a distance from England with a freedom that London and Worcestershire could not provide. He traveled with a young valet who was also his lover. The arrangement was not unusual for a man in Beauchamp's position, and the tradition of the gentleman and the male servant companion had a long unspoken history in the British upper classes, but it depended entirely on discretion. And in Australia, where the Earl's previous service as governor of New South Wales meant that his movements attracted press attention, discretion proved impossible. Australian newspapers noted the Earl's traveling companion. The coverage was not explicit, but it did not need to be. It entered the circulation of information that was already accumulating in London, and it provided the first hard evidence, not just whisper and rumor, but documented, observable behavior that could be used against him. Westminster was watching. He had hired private detectives. He was building a dossier. And the purpose of the dossier was not blackmail, which might have been manageable, but destruction, total, public, irreversible destruction of his sister's husband, and by extension, of the family that husband had built. The sequence of events that followed in the first months of 1931 moved with a speed that the family could not have anticipated and could not resist. Westminster took his evidence to the one authority that could act without the publicity of a courtroom, the king. He presented his dossier to George V directly, knowing that the monarch's personal revulsion, the king was a man of rigid conventional morality, would translate into institutional pressure that no earl, however well connected, could withstand. The meeting between Westminster and the king is not documented in verbatim detail, but the outcome is not in dispute. George V was reported to have said, when shown the evidence, that he had thought men like that shot themselves. It was not a suggestion. It was something worse. It was the assumption of a class and a generation that the correct response to exposure was self-destruction, that a gentleman who had been caught would have the decency to remove himself from the world rather than force society to deal with the consequences of his existence. The king's remark entered the family's mythology. It never left. What followed was not prosecution. That would have meant a public trial, and nobody in Westminster's circle or the palace wanted the spectacle of an earl in the dock on charges of gross indecency. What followed instead was the threat of prosecution, which was far more effective. An arrest warrant was discussed. The possibility of charges under the Criminal Law Amendment Act and the same statute that had sent Oscar Wilde to Reading Jail in 1895, was made real enough to force a choice. The Earl could stay in England and face criminal proceedings that would destroy not only him but his wife, his children, and the family's entire position in society. Or he could leave. He could go quietly, resign his offices, withdraw from public life, and accept exile as the price of avoiding the courtroom and the prison. He left. In the summer of 1931, William Lygon, 7th Earl Beauchamp, Knight of the Garter, Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, former governor of New South Wales, former cabinet minister, father of 7, departed England under threat of arrest and began an exile that would last, with one brief exception, for the rest of his life. He was 59 years old. He resigned the wardenship. He relinquished his offices. He surrendered the garter, that supreme mark of royal favor, that jeweled emblem of everything he had worked to become, because a man under threat of prosecution for gross indecency could not stand before the king as a knight of the realm. The formal machinery of his public life was dismantled in a matter of weeks. What had taken decades to build was stripped away with the efficiency of a class that knew, when the moment came, exactly how to erase someone. He went first to the continent, to France, to Germany, to the wandering, rootless existence of a man who still had money and a title, but no longer had a country. The great houses of Europe were open to him in a way. He was still an earl. He was still rich enough to travel and to live well. But he was also a man in flight, moving from city to city and hotel to hotel with the restlessness of someone who has been told, in every way that matters, that the life he built is over. In those first days and weeks, alone and facing the annihilation of everything he had spent his adult life constructing, he contemplated suicide. The king's remark was in his mind, the assumption that a gentleman caught would have the decency to destroy himself rather than burden society with the consequences of his survival. The code of his class, which had governed every other decision in his life, was now offering him one final instruction. And it was Hugh, his second son, 27 years old, the beautiful, reckless drinking boy who had inherited his father's warmth without his father's capacity for self-protection, who found him in that state and talked him back from the edge. Hugh told his father that the children needed him, that the family, whatever was left of it, still required a father, that the correct response to destruction was not obedience to the code that had cost it. It was the bravest thing any member of the family ever did. It was also the beginning of a burden that Hugh would carry, alongside the drink and the charm and the damage, for the remaining 5 years of his life. Back in England, the machinery of destruction ground forward. Westminster presented the evidence to Lettuce. The precise details of that confrontation, where it happened, what words were used, whether the evidence was laid out in documents or delivered in speech, whether there was a single meeting or a series of them, are not publicly recorded, but the consequences are recorded and they tell their own story. Lettuce collapsed. The word collapse is used deliberately. It appears in various forms across the accounts of what happened to her in those weeks. She had a breakdown. Whether the evidence came as a genuine shock or as the confirmation of something she had long suspected but never confronted is one of the questions that the public record does not resolve. What it does resolve is what she did next. She filed for divorce. The petition, when it came, was not a quiet legal formality. It was a public act of repudiation. The Countess Beauchamp, née Grosvenor, formally severing herself from the man she had married 29 years earlier. The grounds were devastating. The language of the law in those circumstances was not kind. And the filing itself, whatever private agonies it reflected, had an immediate public effect. It confirmed, for anyone who had not yet heard the whispers, that the family at Madresfield was broken. She retreated to Cheshire, to the Grosvenor orbit, to the world of her birth family, where the narrative of her victimhood could be maintained without contradiction, and she aligned herself fully and irrevocably with her brother's campaign against her husband. That alignment is the hinge on which the entire family history turns. It is the decision that the children would judge for the rest of their lives, and it is the decision that the title of this story, Why Everyone Feared Lady Beauchamp, ultimately refers to, though the fear was not the kind that involves trembling in locked doors. It was something more subtle and more lasting. It was the fear of a woman who, when the code of her world offered her a choice between loyalty to the man she had married and loyalty to the family she had been born into, chose blood over bond. It was the fear of what that choice revealed, not just about Lettuce, but about the entire social machinery that had produced her. She did what her world told her to do. Her children never forgave her for it, and there is something about that choice that must be handled with care. Lettuce was not a cartoon villain. She was a woman in her mid-50s who had just been shown evidence that her husband had been conducting a criminal sexual life throughout their marriage. She was a woman whose brother, the most powerful man in her birth family, was demanding that she act. She was a woman whose social world had no script for what was happening except the script of humiliation, divorce, and withdrawal. She was a woman who had spent 30 years building a household, raising 7 children, commissioning a chapel, managing a 5,000-acre estate, and maintaining the appearance that everything was fine, and who had just been told, with documentary evidence, that none of it had been what she thought. Panic, humiliation, rage, dependence on her brother, self-preservation, and genuine shock can all coexist in a single person at a single moment. The public record does not require us to choose one motive. It requires us to see that the consequences of her choice were devastating, regardless of the reasons behind it. The children were ordered to testify against their father. The pressure came from Westminster's side. The legal case for divorce required evidence, and the children's testimony about their father's behavior could have been used to complete the case. What happened next is the moral center of the entire story. The children refused. Not one of them, not Elmley, not Hugh, not Lettice, not Sibel, not Mary, not Dorothy, would testify against their father. They had been raised on the word tolerance. They had spent their afternoons in the library at his feet. They had grown up inside a household that, whatever its concealed fractures, had given them a father who was present, who read to them, who taught them to think and to question and to extend to others the understanding that the world was not always willing to extend to them. And when the moment came, when the pressure from their uncle, from society, from the legal machinery of divorce bore down on them, they chose the father over the mother. They chose the man who had loved them in the library over the woman who was now aligned with the man who had destroyed him. It was not a painless choice. It was not, in any conventional sense, the expected one. In most aristocratic family ruptures of this period, the children would have been pressed into the mother's camp, the mother being the wrong party, the victim of a husband's deviance, the custodial parent by social convention. But the Beauchamp children did not follow convention. They followed something deeper, their own experience of who their parents had been to them. And their experience told them that their father, for all his concealed life, had been the warmer parent, the more attentive one, the one who had built the emotional world they inhabited. Their mother had built the chapel. Their father had read to them on the floor. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Lettice departed Madresfield with Richard, the youngest, the one child who would maintain a relationship with her. She retreated to Cheshire, to the estates and the social world of the Grosvenor family, and she took with her whatever remained of her dignity and her sense of herself as a wronged woman. In the Grosvenor world, her position was clear. She was the victim. She was the wife who had been deceived. She was the woman who had married in good faith and discovered decades later that the marriage had been built on a concealment so fundamental that it invalidated everything. That was the narrative her brother offered her, and it was the narrative she accepted, because the alternative, acknowledging that she had known or suspected and chosen silence, acknowledging that her own complicity in the maintenance of appearances had been part of the structure that now lay in ruins, was more than any woman of her generation and her class could reasonably have been expected to bear. The older children remained at Madresfield, and their refusal to follow their mother became the defining act of the family's internal history. Elmley, as the eldest, bore the weight of holding the household together, a young man in his late 20s who was now, in practical terms, the head of a great house, whose actual head was in exile and whose mistress had departed. The estate still needed managing, the staff still needed directing, the rent still needed collecting. The 5,000 acres did not pause for scandal, and Elmley, who had always been the steady one, the careful one, the son who absorbed responsibility rather than shared it, stepped into the role with the quiet competence that would characterize the rest of his life. He did not dramatize. He endured. Hugh's position was different. He had saved his father's life in those first terrible days, and that act bound him to the exile in a way that none of the other children could share. He began the pattern that would define his remaining years. Drinking in England, visiting his father abroad, drinking more, returning to Madresfield, drinking still more, and carrying alongside the charm that everyone adored and the social ease that everyone envied. A weight of grief and responsibility that a young man of 27 should never have been asked to bear. The Oxford Circle still revolved around him. Was still visited. But the atmosphere at Madresfield had changed. The house was the same. The laughter was thinner. Sibel observed and remembered. Mary bore the most visible public cost. The courtship with Prince George ended quietly and completely, and with it the future that had seemed only months earlier to be within reach. She was 21 years old. She had done nothing wrong. She had not kept a secret, had not facilitated the parallel life, had not hired the detectives or presented the evidence or demanded the exile. She had simply been the daughter of a man whose private truth, once exposed, contaminated everyone connected to him. Dorothy, at 19, absorbed the shock with the particular clarity of the youngest observer. old enough to understand everything, young enough to be shaped by it permanently. Westminster, meanwhile, used his social power to blacklist the family with a thoroughness that went beyond what the scandal itself required. Friends who had dined at Madresfield found reasons to be elsewhere. Invitations dried up. Social doors that had been opened for decades closed with the quiet finality that the English upper classes bring to the exclusion of those who have fallen from favor. The great social network that the Beauchamp name had commanded contracted to a small embattled circle of those who were either brave enough, or loyal enough, or peripheral enough not to care about the Duke of Westminster's displeasure. The family that had once been within reach of the crown was now, in the eyes of the world that mattered to them, untouchable. What remained in the immediate aftermath was this: a great house with no father and no mother, a moated manor in Worcestershire, still magnificent, still staffed, still surrounded by 5,000 acres of farmland and the institutional weight of 5 centuries of continuous occupation. And inside it, a group of young people in their 20s and late teens holding the household together with no parental authority, no clear social standing, and no certainty about what would happen next. Elmley was there, managing the estate with the grim competence of a man who has been handed a burden he cannot refuse. Hugh was there when he was not abroad visiting his father or drinking in London with the friends who still had the nerve to be seen with him. The 3 unmarried sisters, Sibyl, Mary, and Dorothy, were there, occupying the rooms their parents had occupied, eating at the table their parents had sat at, walking the gardens their mother had tended, and the library their father had filled. The house had not changed. The staircase hole still rose through the center of the building. The chapel still gleamed, the moat still circled, but the people inside it had been transformed. They were no longer the children of one of England's most admired families. They were the orphans of a scandal. Not actual orphans, not yet, but functionally parentless in a way that carried its own particular grief. Their father was alive but forbidden to them by geography and law. Their mother was alive but rejected by them in the only act of moral defiance they had ever collectively made. The father was in exile, the mother was in Cheshire. The children were in the house. And society, which had once looked at Madresfield and seen the best of itself, now looked away. Or worse, looked with the particular kind of fascinated pity that the English upper classes reserve for families that have been caught. What does a great house become when the parents are absent, but the disgrace remains? That was the question that Madresfield, in the autumn of 1931, was about to answer. The answer, in the months and years that followed, was something stranger and sadder than anyone outside the family could have predicted. Madresfield did not close. It did not fall into disrepair. It did not empty out the way that scandal-struck country houses sometimes did in that era. The staff dismissed, the furniture covered in dust sheets, the gardens left to grow wild, while the family scattered to rented flats in London and villas on the continent. Madresfield continued. The estate continued. The rents were collected, the tenants were managed, the gardens were tended, the library was used, and inside the house, the remaining Lygon children, Elmley, Hugh, when he was present, Sibyl, Mary, and Dorothy, created something that was not quite a family and not quite a household, but something in between. A gathering of young people in a beautiful, damaged place, holding on to the physical structure of a life whose emotional architecture had been demolished. Elmley ran the estate. He was 28 years old in the autumn of 1931, and the responsibilities that landed on him were not the ones he had been prepared for. He had been raised to inherit a functioning dynasty, a title, a house, a political tradition, a social network, and a father who would guide him through the decades of stewardship that lay ahead. Instead, he inherited the management of a household in crisis, with a father in exile, a mother in Cheshire, a brother drinking himself toward disaster, 3 unmarried sisters whose social prospects had been devastated by the scandal, and a social world that had largely turned its back. He did not complain. He did not dramatize. He ran the estate the way his father would have run it, with the steady, unglamorous competence of a man who understood that 5,000 acres of Worcestershire farmland did not pause for disgrace. The tenants still needed a landlord. The staff still needed wages. The house still needed heat and light and the particular kind of attention that a building of that age and complexity demands if it is not to begin, slowly, to fall apart. But the social isolation was real, and it pressed on the younger siblings in ways that Elmley, shielded by his responsibilities, could partly deflect. The invitations that had once arrived at Madresfield as steady, predictable numbers, the country house weekends, the London dinners, the shooting parties, the dancing, had slowed to a trickle. Westminster's social power was not merely wealth, it was network. He knew everyone. He dined with everyone. And the message he conveyed through the subtle, devastating machinery of aristocratic exclusion was clear. The Beauchamp children were to be avoided, not openly shunned, that would have been vulgar, and the English upper classes prided themselves on never being vulgar, but quietly, firmly set aside. Hostesses who had once been delighted to see the Lygon daughter at their table now discovered scheduling difficulties. Friends who had spent weekends at Madresfield remembered prior engagements. The social world contracted around the siblings like a net, and each of them felt the constriction differently. Sibel, temperamentally inclined toward the private and the reflective, bore the isolation with a stoicism that masked real pain. She had never been the most social of the sisters. That role belonged to Mary, but the narrowing of her world was nonetheless a loss. She was in her mid-20s, unmarried, living in a house that had been designed for a much larger and more confident family, and the pool of eligible young men who might have considered marrying a Lygon daughter had been poisoned by her uncle's campaign. The scandal attached itself to the name with a tenacity that no amount of personal virtue could dislodge. It did not matter that Sibel was intelligent, well-read, and entirely blameless. She was a Beauchamp. That was enough. Mary felt the isolation most acutely. She was 21 years old, beautiful, vivacious, and suddenly radioactive. The courtship with Prince George was over, not merely paused or postponed, but extinguished, as completely as if it had never existed. There would be no royal engagement. There would be no wedding at Westminster Abbey. There would be no photographs in the illustrated London News of a Lygon daughter entering the House of Windsor. That future, which had been real and close enough to touch, had been removed from her life by a decision she had played no part in and a scandal she had done nothing to cause. The injustice of it. The pure structural unfairness of a young woman's prospects being destroyed by her father's private life and her uncle's vindictiveness, and one of the details in this story that is worth sitting with. Mary had been good. Mary had been charming. Mary had been exactly what the royal family was looking for, and none of it mattered because the name she carried had been poison. She responded to the loss in the way that many people respond to the sudden removal of a future they had counted on. She carried on, she socialized, she maintained the appearance of normality, and she began quietly and then less quietly to drink. The drinking would worsen over the years. It would become part of the pattern of her life. The bright surface and the damage beneath, the charm that everyone noticed, and the sadness that fewer people chose to see. But in 1931 and 1932, the drinking was not yet a crisis. It was a coping mechanism. It was a way of getting through the evenings in a great house where the library was full of books about tolerance, and the chapel was full of beauty that her mother had built and her father could no longer see. Dorothy, at 19, watched everything with the particular alertness of the youngest present daughter. She was old enough to understand the dynamics, the uncle's vendetta, the mother's capitulation, the father's exile, the siblings' defiance, but young enough to be formed by them in the ways that the older children, whose characters were already more fixed, were not. That she became in those years the family's unofficial archivist, the one who remembered the details, who noticed the small changes in atmosphere, who could tell you, decades later, exactly how the household had reconfigured itself around the absence of its two heads. Her later recollections describe a household that was simultaneously grand and hollowed out. The meals were served, the routines were maintained, the house functioned as a house, but the animating presence, the father reading in the library, the mother directing the household, the sense of a family operating as a complete unit, was gone. What replaced it was something improvised, brave, and fundamentally precarious. And then there was Waugh. Evelyn Waugh had been a friend of Hugh's at Oxford. And through Hugh, he had entered the Lygon orbit in the late 1920s. By the time of the scandal, he was already a rising literary figure. Decline and Fall had been published in 1928, Vile Bodies in 1930, but his relationship with the Lygons was not professional. It was personal, intimate, and rooted in a genuine affection for the family and the world they represented. He visited Madresfield. He wrote letters to the sisters, Mary and Dorothy in particular, that were warm, funny, and laced with the private language of a friendship that had survived the social earthquake. He addressed Mary as Blondie and Dorothy as Pole. He was one of the few people outside the immediate family who continued to treat the Lygons as human beings rather than as the protagonists of a scandal. But Wall was also a writer, and writers use what they see. The family that he found at Madresfield in the years after 1931. The fatherless household, the beautiful damaged siblings, the great house preserved in amber while the people inside it struggled to hold their lives together, would become the raw material for the novel that would make him famous. He did not write Brideshead Revisited until 1944, and by then the family's story had been filtered through more than a decade of memory, imagination, and the particular kind of artistic transformation that turns lived experience into something simultaneously more and less than the truth. But the seeds were planted in those years at Madresfield. What Waugh found at the house was not squalor or visible ruin. It was something more unsettling, perfection without purpose. The rooms were beautiful, the grounds were maintained, the library was stocked, and the chapel was still, and the moat still circled the house like a sentence that had never been completed. But the people inside the house were living in the aftermath of an explosion, and the contrast between the physical splendor of their surroundings and the emotional devastation of their circumstances gave the place a quality that Waugh, with his novelist's instinct for the gap between surface and reality, could not fail to recognize. The library, the chapel, the moat, the beautiful reckless brother, the sisters in their 20s with their futures narrowed by someone else's disgrace, the absent father, the sense of a world in which sin and grace and the weight of family operated on a scale that ordinary life could not accommodate. Waugh had converted to Catholicism in 1930, and the conversion gave him a framework for understanding suffering that the secular world could not provide. All of it would find its way into the novel. The Lygons would become the Flights. Madresfield would become Brideshead, and the private agony of a real family would be transmuted into one of the most celebrated fictions of the 20th century. That was still years away. But the process had already begun. In the drawing rooms and the long weekends and the letters that Waugh exchanged with the sisters, whose world he was quietly memorizing. Hugh, meanwhile, was deteriorating. The word is harsh but accurate. In the years following his father's exile, Hugh Lygon's life followed a trajectory that combined external charm with internal collapse in a way that those closest to him could see but could not arrest. He was still beautiful. He was still funny. He was still the young man whose company people sought and whose laughter could fill a room. But the drinking, which had always been part of his social persona, the Oxford drinking, the bright young people drinking, the drinking that was expected of a young man of his class and generation, was now something else entirely. It was heavier, more compulsive, more clearly connected to the pain that he carried and could not put down. He had saved his father's life in the first days of exile. He had refused to testify against him. He had chosen loyalty over self-preservation. And the cost of that loyalty is the emotional weight of being the son who had held the breaking family together through sheer force of warmth and will, was extracting a toll that his body and his spirit could not indefinitely sustain. He visited his father abroad, traveling to the continent in the pattern that all the children adopted, rotating visits that kept the connection alive across the distance of exile. The children went to their father because their father could not come to them. They sat with him in hotels and rented houses and the borrowed drawing rooms of sympathetic friends. And they tried to maintain, across the geography of disgrace, some thread of the relationship that the library at Madresfield had once made effortless. Hugh's visits were the most emotionally charged because Hugh was the most emotionally open of all the siblings. He could not protect himself from his father's pain. He absorbed it. He saw what exile had done to the 7th Earl. The diminishment, the purposelessness, the particular kind of loneliness that settles on a man who has spent his entire adult life in public service and has been told that the public no longer wants him. He absorbed that grief and brought it back to England, where his own life was increasingly shapeless. In the years between 1931 and his death, Hugh moved through the social world of interwar London with a restlessness that his friends noticed and could not alleviate. He drank at the parties, he drank at the clubs, he drank at Madresfield, where the cellars were still stocked and the evenings still long. He was not a solitary drinker. That was not his nature. He was a social drinker, a generous drinker, a man who poured for others as freely as he poured for himself, and whose company was so magnetic that people continued to seek it out even as they recognized that the magnetism was beginning to flicker. He was thinner than he had been at Oxford. He was less steady. The laughter that had once seemed effortless now carried a quality that the perceptive could hear. Something brittle beneath the warmth, something that sounded, if you listen carefully, less like joy than like the sound a person makes when they are trying very hard not to cry. He had no career to speak of. He had no settled purpose. He had the Madresfield name, which was now as much burden as asset. And he had his friends, and he had drink, and he had the particular kind of a nihilistic gaiety that covers despair with laughter because the alternative is silence, and silence was what the family had been taught to fear. The parallel between Hugh Lygon and Sebastian Flyte, the doomed, charming, self-destructive younger son of a great Catholic household in Brideshead Revisited, is one of the most discussed connections in English literary history. Waugh always resisted a simple identification. Sebastian was not Hugh, not exactly. The novel transformed the material, changed the religion, altered the family dynamics, rearranged the gender and the sexuality and the geography. But the emotional core was unmistakable. The beauty, the vulnerability, the drinking, the flight from a family that was simultaneously a source of love and a machine of destruction. Waugh saw in Hugh something that he understood instinctively. The way that certain people, born into worlds of privilege and expectation, are broken not by poverty or obscurity, but by the weight of being who they are inside a structure that cannot accommodate them. Hugh was not homosexual. As far as the public record indicates, his father was. But the damage that flowed from the father's exposure fell on the son, with a force that the father at least had the resources of age and experience to partially absorb. Hugh had only his youth, and his youth, as the 1930s progressed, was visibly running out. In the summer of 1936, 2 deaths struck the family in rapid and devastating succession, and neither offered anything that could be called resolution or peace. On the 19th of August, 1936, Hugh Patrick Lygon died in Rothenburg ob der Tauber, a medieval town in Bavaria. He was 32 years old. The circumstances of his death have been described in various accounts. He had been traveling in Germany. There was a car accident. There were injuries that he did not survive. The details are sparse in the way that details from that era and that class often are. The family did not invite scrutiny. The German authorities did not elaborate. And the passage of time has turned what was once a fresh and terrible grief into a paragraph in biographies and obituaries. What is not in dispute is that he died abroad, far from Madresfield, far from the library where his father had read to him as a child, far from the moated house that his family had held for 5 centuries and that he would never see again. He died in the country to which his father had first fled after the exile began. There is something about that geography, the son dying in the land of the father's exile, that carries a weight beyond coincidence. Hugh had been one of the children who visited most faithfully, who crossed the Channel to sit with the 7th Earl in his diminished continental life, who refused to let the distance imposed by scandal and law become a permanent severance. He had gone to Germany not as a tourist, but as a son, and he died there as a son. As a young man whose connection to his father had drawn him repeatedly to the places where his father's broken life was being lived out. His death sent a shockwave through the scattered family, the children who had held together through the worst years, who had refused to testify, who had rejected their mother, who had maintained the house, who had visited the exile, now had to confront the fact that their solidarity had not been enough to save one of their own. Hugh had been the warmest of them, the most emotionally available, the one who carried the family's grief most openly and paid for it most dearly. His death was not, in the strict medical sense, a suicide, but it was the end of a process that had begun in 1931 when a 27-year-old son talked his father out of killing himself and took on in that act a weight of pain that he would spend the next 5 years trying to outrun with drink and laughter and the desperate gaiety of a young man who knows, at some level he cannot afford to examine, that the race is already lost. His death turned the exile from a condition into a body count. Before Hugh died, the scandal's consequences were social, emotional, reputational, devastating certainly, but survivable in the way that disgrace, given enough time and enough distance, can sometimes be survived. After Hugh died, the consequences included a coffin, the family that had refused to testify against their father, that had chosen loyalty over convention, that had held the house together through the worst years of isolation, now had to absorb the death of one of its own. And the death itself was an act of geography that underlined everything the scandal had done. Hugh died in Germany, not in England, because the world that the Lygons inhabited had been reorganized by exile and disgrace in ways that meant even dying happened in the wrong country. Lettice, the mother, the countess, the woman whose choice had split the family, died later that same year, in 1936. She was 60 years old. She had spent the last 5 years of her life in the Grosvenor orbit in Cheshire, among the people and the places of her birth family, maintaining the narrative that Westminster had constructed for her, that she was the wronged wife, the betrayed woman, the victim of a husband's depravity. Whether she believed that narrative fully, or whether the private hours brought doubts and second thoughts and the aching recognition that the children she had lost were lost because of choices she had made as much as choices that had been made to her, is not recorded. The public face of Lettice Beauchamp in her final years was one of wounded dignity. The private face is unknowable. What is known is that she died still estranged from nearly all of her children. The reconciliation that might have come, the softening that time sometimes produces in families broken by crisis, the recognition that blame is rarely as simple as it seems in the first terrible weeks, that fear drove decisions that love might have prevented, did not come. Not in 5 years, not on her deathbed. The estrangement held with a rigidity that tells you something about the depth of the wound. The children did not rush to their mother's side. They did not, in the conventional sense, mourn her as a mother. They mourned her, if at all, as a figure from another life. The woman who had built the chapel and commissioned the beauty, and then, when the crisis came, had sided with the brother who set the fire rather than with the husband who was consumed by it. That is not a detail that invites easy judgment. It is a detail that invites something closer to wonder at the sheer intransigence of family grief. The way that some breaks, once made, cannot be mended by time, or by death, or by the simple passage of years that ought, in theory, to soften everything. The Beauchamp children had made their choice in 1931. They had chosen their father, and the corollary of that choice, the rejection of their mother, had hardened across 5 years of silence and estrangement into something that not even death could undo. Lettice Beauchamp, Countess Beauchamp, née Grosvenor, was buried without the forgiveness of the children she had borne and raised and lost. That was the price she paid for siding with Westminster. Whether the price was fair is not a question the narrator can answer. It is a question the story leaves with the viewer. By the end of 1936, the family's losses could be counted, but their weight was immeasurable. 2 deaths in 1 year, the son and the mother, the most vivid casualty and the most contested figure, had compressed the entire tragedy into a single calendar. The 7th Earl received the news of Hugh's death abroad, in the exile from which he could not return to attend his own son's funeral. He received the news of Lettice's death with whatever mixture of grief, guilt, and bitter recognition a man feels when the woman he married and failed and lost dies without forgiving him, or without being forgiven by the children who had chosen his side. He was 64 years old. He had 2 more years to live, though he did not know that yet. Elmley was still at Madresfield, still managing, still carrying the heir's burden with quiet, unshowy determination. Lady Lettice, the eldest daughter, was married and living her own life, increasingly distant from the household that had defined her childhood. Sibylle was in her late 20s, unmarried, watchful, carrying the family's memory with a precision that would prove, in the decades to come, invaluable to anyone who wanted to understand who these people really were. Mary was 26 and drinking with a steadiness that her friends noticed and her family could not prevent. Dorothy was 24, sharp-eyed and resilient, building the foundations of a life that would take her far from Worcestershire, to war work, to Addis Ababa, to the particular kind of English independence that women of her class and generation could fashion from the wreckage of conventional expectations. And Dickie, the youngest, was 20 years old and navigating the impossible position of being the one child who had maintained a connection to both parents, the bridge across a chasm that the rest of the family had declared uncrossable. Each of them was now charting a course that would diverge further with every passing year. Elmley would inherit the title and the house, but not the family that gave either meaning. And he would inherit it soon, though he did not yet know how soon. Mary would marry, badly, and the marriage would become its own kind of exile. She would marry Prince Vsevolod Ivanovich of Russia, a match that carried a title but little else, a union between a woman whose royal future had been stolen and a man whose royal past had been obliterated by revolution. They would share drink and debt and the particular kind of mutual diminishment that occurs when two people who have both lost their best prospects try to build a life from what remains. The marriage would not save Mary. Nothing would save Mary, in the way that nothing saves certain people whose defining wound was inflicted too early and too deeply for any subsequent happiness to fully heal. She would carry the scandal's cost more visibly than any of her siblings. Not because she was weaker, but because the thing that was taken from her was the most specific, a named future, a particular man, a particular life that she could see and almost touch before it was removed. Sibel would marry eventually, late by the standards of her world, but her deepest attachment would always be to the memory of what the family had been before the fall, the afternoons in the library, the father's voice reading aloud, the word tolerance offered to them like a creed that no one outside the moat would honor. She would live longest of all the siblings, and she would become, in her extreme old age, the keeper of a flame that no one else was left to tend. Dorothy would build a life of service and eccentricity that carried her far from Worcestershire to war work during the conflict that was now, in 1936, beginning to gather on the European horizon, and later to Ethiopia, where she would work at the British Embassy in Addis Ababa with the resourcefulness and dry humor that the scandal years had instilled in her. She would marry late at 53 to a man named Robert Haber Percy, who was 24 years her senior and was himself a figure of considerable eccentricity. The marriage was not conventional. Very little about Dorothy was conventional. The scandal had given her, along with everything it had taken, a certain freedom from the expectations that would have governed her life if the family had remained intact. She could not be the daughter of a great house if the great house was no longer great in the way the world required. She could only be herself. And so she was, and Dickie, the exception, the bridge, the youngest, would become, through the quiet mathematics of inheritance and survival, the one whose line would eventually hold the house itself. His marriage would produce children, his children would produce grandchildren, and the name on the deeds of Madresfield Court, when the dust of the 20th century had settled, would trace back not through the eldest son or the second son, but through the youngest, the child who had maintained a relationship with both parents, the one who refused to choose sides completely, the one whose survival strategy was not defiance, but something closer to quiet persistence. None of them had recovered from 1931. None of them would. The scandal had not faded with time. It had calcified. The loyalty they had shown their father, the refusal to testify, the rejection of their mother, the years of visiting the exile abroad, the brave and futile attempt to hold a household together inside a house that was too large for the family that remained, had not restored what was lost. It had not brought the father home. It had not reversed the scandal or rebuilt the social world that Westminster had demolished. It had cost them their mother, it had cost them Hugh, and it had not, in any meaningful sense, saved anyone. Hugh was dead. The mother was dead. The father was still in exile, still alive, still carrying the title that meant everything and nothing simultaneously. And the children who had chosen loyalty over convention were now discovering the cruelest truth of the whole story: that loyalty, however brave, however morally coherent, however rooted in the genuine love of a father who had read to them on the library floor, does not guarantee a happy outcome. It only guarantees that the people who practice it will carry the full weight of everything that follows. Years between Hugh's death and the end of the seventh Earl's life were the years in which the family's destruction became irrevocable. Before 1936, there had been, however faintly, the possibility of return. The exile might end, the political climate might shift, the threat of prosecution might recede, the father might come home. The children had held the house together partly on that hope, the unspoken belief that the separation was temporary, that the code which had expelled their father from England might one day relax enough to let him back in. Hugh's death damaged that hope. It did not destroy it. The surviving children were too loyal and too stubborn to abandon it entirely. But it damaged it in a way that changed the quality of the waiting. Before Hugh's death, the children waited for restoration. After it, they waited for something less defined. Not a happy ending, but an ending of any kind that might allow them to stop holding their breath. Lettuce's death, paradoxically, might have strengthened the practical case for the father's return. With the Countess gone, the divorce proceedings that had been grinding forward through the courts lost their human engine. There was no wronged wife to satisfy, no Grosvenor honor to avenge through legal process. The petition that Lettuce had filed, that public act of repudiation, with its devastating language and its formal severance of the marriage bond, and was now moot. Westminster was still alive, still powerful, still vindictive. But the specific machinery that he had set in motion required a plaintiff, and the plaintiff was dead. The law had lost its emotional force. The threat remained, but the urgency behind it had diminished. And so, in the strange arithmetic of scandal and law, the seventh Earl began to contemplate what had seemed impossible for 5 years: going home. The details of his attempted return are not fully documented in publicly accessible sources, but the outline of it is clear enough. At some point after Lettuce's death, the legal barriers to the Earl's presence in England shifted. The divorce was no longer a live proceeding. The threat of prosecution, while never formally withdrawn, had lost some of its political urgency. The men who had demanded his exile in 1931 had other concerns by the mid-1930s, and the approaching shadow of European conflict was beginning to make the private lives of elderly earls seem less pressing than they had in the more leisured atmosphere of the early decade. The Earl returned to England briefly. He crossed the Channel. He came back to the country that had expelled him. He saw Madresfield again. There is something about that moment, the exiled father crossing the moat for the first time in years, entering the house that he had built and lost, walking through rooms that had been maintained in his absence by the children who had chosen him over their mother, that demands the viewer's full attention. The staircase hall was still there, rising through the center of the building with its carved wood and its stained glass, and its heraldic declarations of permanence. The chapel was still there. The chapel that Lettuce had commissioned, that gesture of faith and conjugal ambition, that now stood as a monument to a marriage that had been destroyed. The library was still there, the books still on the shelves, the floor where he had lain, reading to his daughters still worn smooth in the same places. Everything was the same. Nothing was the same. The house remembered him. The house could not undo what had happened to him. But the return was not a restoration. It could not be. The house was the same, but the household was gone. Hugh was dead. Lettuce was dead. The daughters were scattered or scarred. Elmley was running the estate with the efficiency of a man who has stopped expecting anything from the future except the next set of accounts. The social world that had once revolved around the Beauchamp name had moved on. Not forgiven, not forgotten, simply moved on, in the way that English society moves past its scandals when newer, more interesting ones present themselves. The Earl came home to a house that remembered him and a world that did not particularly want him back. The return was not permanent. England did not feel safe. The shadow of Westminster's influence had not entirely lifted, and the Earl himself, by now in his mid-60s, was not the man he had been. There is something about that return, the brief, unsatisfying, incomplete return of a man to the place that defined him, that carries its own particular cruelty. Exile is devastating when it's absolute, but exile that offers a glimpse of what was lost and then withdraws it again is something worse. The Earl saw Madresfield. He saw the moat and the chapel and the staircase hall. He saw the gardens that his wife attended and the library where he had read to his children about tolerance. He walked through rooms that had been waiting for him, maintained by children who had chosen his side and kept the house alive on his behalf. He smelled the particular smell of an old English house, stone and wood and polish, and the faint dampness that no amount of heating can fully dispel. He was home. And then he understood that home was no longer a place he could inhabit. The return had shown him what he had lost, with a clarity that exile paradoxically had blurred. In exile, Madresfield existed in memory, softened, idealized, preserved in the amber of longing. In person, Madresfield existed, in fact, unchanged, magnificent, and utterly empty of the life that had once filled it. But the return was not permanent. England did not feel safe. The shadow of Westminster's influence had not entirely lifted. The threat of prosecution, however diminished, had not been formally withdrawn. And the Earl himself, by now in his mid-60s, was not the man he had been. 7 years of exile had done what exile does to people of purpose. It had removed the purpose. He had no office, no public role, no constituency, no function. He was an earl without an earldom in any meaningful sense. A title attached to a man who had been told by his king and his society and the law of his country that his existence was a problem to be solved by absence. The brief return ended. He left Madresfield again. He crossed the moat in the other direction. He returned to the continent, to the hotels and the rented rooms and the slow diminishing circuit of a life in exile. 7 years of exile had done what exile does to people of purpose. It had removed the purpose. He had no office, no public role, no constituency, no function. He was an earl without an earldom in any meaningful sense, a title attached to a man who had been told by his king and his society and the law of his country that his existence was a problem to be solved by absence. He returned to the continent. He moved between cities. He had money. The estate still produced income, and the family's financial position, while diminished by the costs of the scandal and the legal proceedings, was not desperate. He could afford hotels, he could afford travel, he could afford the outward appearance of a gentleman of leisure moving through Europe in the comfortable twilight of a long career. What he could not afford was the illusion that any of it meant anything. The life of a wealthy exile in 1930s Europe was not on the surface a life of suffering. There were hotels in Venice and apartments in Paris and the coastal towns of the south of France where English gentlemen of a certain kind had been living discreetly for decades, men whose private lives required a latitude that England would not provide. The seventh Earl moved through this world with the ease that money buys and the emptiness that displacement creates. He was received. He was not shunned, as he had been in England. On the continent, a disgraced English earl was merely exotic, not dangerous. The social roles were different. The tolerance that he had taught his daughters on the library floor at Madresfield actually existed in a limited and transactional way in the cafes and salons of continental Europe. But tolerance at a distance is not the same as acceptance at home, and the Earl's life abroad had the quality of a performance without an audience. The forms of a comfortable existence, maintained in a place where none of it connected to anything that mattered. He was 65 years old. He had lost his wife, his son, his offices, his social standing, his country, and the daily presence of the children he had raised with such care and such concealment. What remained was the title, the money, and the particular kind of loneliness that settles on a man who has been told that the world he built was a lie and that the truth behind it disqualifies him from everything he once possessed. The children still visited, Sibel, Mary, Dorothy, Dickie, crossing the channel in rotation to sit with their father and maintain the thread of connection that the scandal had stretched nearly to breaking. But the visits were brief, and the intervals between them were long, and the father's awareness that his children were coming to him out of love and duty rather than need, that they had their own lives, their own damage, their own futures to navigate in a world that had punished them for his choices, added another layer of grief to an existence that was already saturated with it. Mary, in those same years, was assembling the pieces of the life that the scandal had left her. She married Prince Vsevolod Ivanovich of Russia in 1937, a match that looked on paper like the kind of glamorous international alliance that the daughter of an English earl might make. A Lygon marrying a Romanov, an English aristocrat uniting with Russian royalty. The names sounded magnificent together. The reality was different. Vsevolod was a member of the extended Romanov family, a cousin of the murdered Tsar, which meant that his title was real, but his prospects were non existent. The Russian Revolution had scattered the Romanovs across Europe like seeds blown from a dead tree. And the princes and grand dukes who survived carried their names like luggage from a country that no longer existed. They lived in Paris apartments and London boarding houses and the borrowed country houses of sympathetic friends. And they maintained, with a tenacity that was sometimes admirable and sometimes merely sad, the forms of a world that had been swept away. Vsevolod had charm. He had a title. He had manners and breeding and the particular kind of melancholy glamour that attached to dispossessed European royalty in the interwar years. He did not have money, stability, or the kind of settled future that Mary needed and deserved. The marriage was, from the beginning, a union of two people whose best possibilities had been destroyed by forces beyond their control. His by revolution, hers by scandal. They shared a fondness for drink that would, over the years, shade from social habit into something more dangerous and more isolating. They shared financial anxiety, the kind that comes from having a title and a lifestyle expectation that the bank balance cannot support. They shared the particular kind of social performance that people with famous names and empty bank accounts learn to maintain in the drawing rooms of those who are still solvent. And they shared, though neither may have articulated it in quite these terms, the experience of having been cheated, of having stood at the edge of a future that was snatched away by someone else's catastrophe. The marriage would deteriorate over the years into something that resembled less and less a partnership and more a shared decline. Mary was 27 years old. She had once been on the verge of marrying into the British royal family. She was now married to a penniless Russian prince in a world that was about to go to war. The distance between those two futures is the measure of what the scandal cost her. Sibel, in her early 30s now, remained unmarried. The marriage market that her class relied upon, the network of introductions, house parties, and social occasions through which suitable matches were identified and pursued, had been closed to her by the scandal, and the years that followed had not reopened it with any urgency. She lived quietly, read widely, and carried with her the memories of the family's best years with a fidelity that no external event could shake. The afternoons in the library remained vivid to her in a way that suggested not merely recollection, but preservation, as though she had understood, even at the time, that what was happening in that room was precious and precarious and would need to be remembered by someone after it was gone. She would marry eventually, Sir Michael Rowley, in 1939 on the very eve of war. But the marriage would come late and would never displace the central attachment of her emotional life, which was to the memory of her father and the house and the afternoons that Westminster's vendetta had destroyed. Sibel was not dramatic about this. She was not ostentatious in her grief. She simply carried it the way that certain people carry the weight of what they have lost, with a quietness that makes the weight no lighter, but makes the carrying possible. Dorothy was finding her own path, with the resourcefulness of a young woman who has learned earlier than most that the conventional structures of her world cannot be relied upon. The war that was coming, the great, consuming, world-reshaping war that would arrive in September 1939, would give Dorothy something the peacetime had not, a purpose that had nothing to do with the Beauchamp name or the scandal or the expectations of her class. She would serve. She would work. She would discover, in the machinery of wartime, a capacity for organization and independence that the drawing rooms of Worcestershire had never had occasion to reveal, but that was still in the future. In 1937 and 1938, Dorothy was 25 and then 26, living in the long aftermath of a family catastrophe that had not ended so much as entered a chronic phase. The phase in which the acute pain gives way to something duller and more permanent. A low-grade grief that becomes, over time, indistinguishable from the texture of ordinary life. She was sharp, She was funny in the dry, understated way that her class cultivated and that her particular experience had sharpened into something genuine. And she was watching, as she had always watched, with the attention of a woman who knew that what she was seeing mattered and would need to be remembered. And Elmley waited. He waited for the inheritance that was coming, though the word inheritance implies something desired. And what was coming to Elmley was not desired, it was owed. It was expected. It was the obligation of an eldest son in a system that gave him no choice but to accept whatever his father's life had left behind. He had been managing the estate for 7 years. He knew every field, every tenant, every roof that leaked, every wall that needed repointing. He knew the household accounts and the agricultural yields and the costs of maintaining a building that was simultaneously a family home, a historical monument, and a symbol of continuity that the family itself could no longer sustain. He was ready in the practical sense. He was not ready in any emotional sense for what the inheritance would confirm, that he was the last earl, or at least the beginning of the last earl, because the family that had built the earldom across generations was now reduced to a man standing alone in a house designed for something much larger than one person's life. The autumn of 1938 arrived, and with it the final weeks of the seventh earl's life. Europe was in crisis. The Munich Agreement had been signed in September, Chamberlain's paper, Hitler's promise, the brief and fraudulent reprieve that bought the world 11 months before the war began. The political order that the seventh Earl had served for decades, the liberal establishment, the parliamentary tradition, the measured civilized machinery of British governance, was being overtaken by events that made its assumptions look fragile and perhaps naive. The world was changing, the old certainties were failing, and the seventh Earl, who had once stood at the center of that world and been expelled from it for a truth that the world could not accommodate, was in New York. He was in the United States, in Manhattan, a city that was as far from Madresfield as geography could place him, while still keeping him within the orbit of the English-speaking world. New York, in the autumn of 1938, was a city of enormous energy, of skyscrapers and crowds and the restless forward motion of a country that had not yet entered the war, that was consuming Europe's attention. It was not a place for an elderly English earl in decline. It was not a place that understood moats or chapels or the significance of a staircase hall in Worcestershire. It was merely the place where he happened to be. One more stop in the long, directionless wandering that exile had become. Whether he chose New York deliberately or arrived there through the accumulated drift of years of continental movement is not entirely clear. What is clear is that he was ill. The years of exile had worn him down in ways that went beyond the ordinary diminishments of age. He was 66, which is not old by the standards of his class and generation. Men of his background routinely lived into their 70s and 80s, sustained by money and medicine and the particular kind of constitutional toughness that the English upper classes bred into their sons through cold baths and cross-country runs at school. But the seventh Earl's decline was not physical alone, it was existential. The loss of Hugh had struck a blow from which there was no recovery. The estrangement from Lettice, sealed by her death, had closed a chapter that could never be reopened or revised. The endless movement, France, Germany, Italy, and now America, and had the quality not of adventure but of flight. And the thing he was fleeing from was not a pursuer, but an absence. The absence of purpose, of home, of the daily life that had once been so full of office and duty and children and books. He was staying at a hotel in New York. The specific name of the hotel, the specific floor, the specific view from his window, these details are not preserved in the accessible public record with the precision that the most intimate telling would require. What survives is the architecture of the situation. An elderly Englishman, alone in a foreign city, in a hotel room in the late autumn of a year that was ending badly for everyone. He had money. He could afford comfort. He was not destitute or abandoned in any material sense. But the comfort of a hotel room in New York is not the comfort of a moated house in Worcestershire, where your family has lived for 500 years. And the presence of hotel staff is not the presence of children who once lay at your feet while you read to them about tolerance. On the 14th of November, 1938, William Lygon, 7th Earl Beauchamp, Knight of the Garter, or rather former Knight of the Garter, that honor having been among the things surrendered in the first terrible weeks of exile, died in New York City. He was 66 years old. He died in exile. He died in a hotel. He died in a country that was not his own, on a continent that had no connection to the 5 centuries of continuity that his family had built in Worcestershire. He died more than 3,000 miles from the moated manor house where he had been born, where he had been raised, where he had married, where his 7 children had been born, where he had read aloud in the library and worshipped in the chapel and climbed the staircase hall that declared in every carved panel and stained glass window that the Lygons endured. He died as far from that declaration as it was possible to die. There is something about that distance, 3,000 miles, an ocean, a continent, that must be understood not as a geographical fact, but as a measure of what the scandal had done. The man who had been born inside the moat died outside it. The man who had been the most visible embodiment of the family's code, continuity, stewardship, public duty, the house outlasting the people inside it, died in a place where nobody knew about the code and nobody cared. The distance between the moat and the hotel room is the distance between the life he was supposed to live and the life that the exposure of his private truth forced upon him. It is the distance between the word tolerance, which he taught his daughters on the library floor, and the world's refusal to practice it. His death was not violent. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet, diminishing end of a man who had been worn down by years of displacement and grief and the slow erosion of everything that had given his life its shape. He had been ill. He had been declining. The body simply reached the point where it could no longer sustain the effort of living in a world that had told him, in every way that mattered, that his existence was a problem best solved by absence. And so he was absent. Permanently this time. The news reached England across the Atlantic. It reached Madresfield by the routes that such news travels. Telegram, telephone, the formal notification that the machinery of death and inheritance requires. Elmley received it. He had been expecting it in the way that people who have watched someone decline over years expect the end without ever being fully prepared for its arrival. He understood, with the clarity that comes not from surprise but from confirmation, that the waiting was over. He was now the 8th Earl Beauchamp. The title had passed, the house was his. The estate, the 4,000 acres, the tenants, the farm buildings, the gardens, the moat, the chapel, the staircase hole, the library, was now, formally and irrevocably, his to carry. He was 35 years old. He had spent the last 7 years managing the estate on his father's behalf, running a household without parents, maintaining a property whose magnificence was a daily reminder of what had been lost and what had been taken. He had done it quietly, competently, without theatrics or self-pity. He had kept the house warm. He had kept the gardens tended. He had kept the tenants housed and the rents collected and the fabric of the estate intact through a period that would have broken a less steady man. And now the inheritance was official, and what it brought was not restoration, but confirmation. The family that had given the earldom its meaning was gone. Hugh was dead at 32. The mother was dead at 60, unforgiven. The father was dead at 66, in exile. The eldest daughter was married and distant. Sibylle was about to marry on the eve of a war. Mary was married to a penniless Russian prince and drinking. Dorothy was finding her way toward a life of service that would carry her far from Worcestershire. Dickie was 22 and navigating his own path. The social world that had once admired the Beauchamp name had moved on to other scandals, other families, other names. The house remained. The title remained. The moat still circled. The chapel still gleamed with the beauty that Lettuce had commissioned in 1902 as a wedding present and an act of faith. The staircase hole still rose through the center of the building, declaring in carved wood and stained glass that the Lygons had been here before and would be here after. But the people who had made those declarations real, the father who believed in tolerance, the mother who built the chapel, the brother who saved a life and then lost his own, the sisters who lay at their father's feet in the library and absorbed the word that would define their loyalties forever, were gone or changed or broken in ways that no title and no house and no 4,000 acres of Worcestershire farmland could mend. Westminster, the architect of the destruction, was still alive. He would live until 1953, dying at the age of 74, having outlived the man he ruined by 15 years. He was never held to account for what he did. He was never asked by any authority that mattered to justify the campaign that had destroyed his sister's household, contributed to the death of his nephew, driven his brother-in-law into an exile from which he never returned, and estranged his sister from nearly every child she had borne. He lived out his remaining years in the enormous Grosvenor wealth, surrounded by the social world that had done his bidding when it mattered and forgotten the details when it suited them. He married again. He entertained. He hunted and raced and moved through the drawing rooms of England with the confidence of a man who believed, to the end of his life, that what he had done to the Beauchamp was not merely justified but righteous. That is the kind of ending that resists the neat satisfactions of a narrative justice. The villain prospered, the victims did not, and the house, which had survived everything else, 5 centuries, a civil war, the erosion of the old order, the scandal, the exile, the deaths, survived that too. The title survives, the viewer might think at this point. The house survives, perhaps the worst is over. But the title that Elmley now carried was a name attached to a ruin, and the house that surrounded him was a monument to people who were dead or scattered, or drinking themselves toward futures that none of them had chosen. The 8th Earl Beauchamp sat inside Madresfield Court in the winter of 1938, the youngest earl in a line that stretched back to 1815, and what he possessed was magnificent, and what he had lost was everything that made the magnificence bearable. He did not know it yet. Nobody did, but the earldom that had just passed to him would be the last transfer. He would hold the title for 41 years. He would hold Madresfield for 4 decades. And when he died in 1979, the earldom of Beauchamp would die with him because the 8th Earl would have no son. And the title that had been earned by public service and destroyed by private truth would pass into extinction as quietly as a candle going out in an empty room.